Stalin's first sentence of chapter 1 asks this question: when did Joseph Stalin decide to crush or destroy or kill Leon Trotsky? His book tells the complicated story. Question right out of the box: when did Joseph Stalin decide to crush or destroy or kill Leon Trotsky? What's the answer?
I think that decision is difficult to place in time. But I think the thing you can be absolutely certain of is that there was an antipathy between the two men pretty much from probably since from the very moment they first met. You know, there was a lot that was incredibly similar about them. You know, they're two men who have very similar backgrounds. They're both born on the edges of the old Russian Empire. They both come from humble families, where the sorts of families that would never have normally been the springboard for people who would go on to hold, you know, global power. So in that sense, their destinies are sort of knitted together. But at the same time, they were such different personalities. They had ambitions that clashed with each other. They had a sort of physical loathing for one another. And all of this is made extra sharp by the sort of environment they were in. They were part of a revolutionary group, which, as everyone knows, are always liable to internecine rivalries, you know, personal antipathy. So Stalin was a big planner. He was a person who didn't say a great deal, but thought a lot and planned a lot. So it's absolutely possible that even on the very first day he met Trotsky, he was beginning to think about how he might get rid of him.
Why did you want to do a book on Trotsky?
Well, it was the thing that interested me was that I felt as if I'd always been interested in Russian history and Russia and that era, and what I knew about the assassination could be sort of boiled down to two or three quite small facts. I knew that it happened in Mexico. I knew that it happened in 1940, and I knew that the weapon that was used to kill Trotsky was an ice pick. But beyond that, I realized that I didn't know a great deal. I wanted to know how someone who had once been such a central figure in one of the big events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution, had ended up as an exile thousands of miles away from his homeland. And I also wanted to know who was on the other side, who was the other man in the room. Because I think a lot of the other sort of great assassinations or murders in history, you kind of know both sides. You know that it was Brutus with a knife on the Ides of March. You know that it's Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. And I wanted to know who had killed Trotsky and what had driven him to that point. So I think that once I started asking those questions, and then, you know, you start following threads and you realize that the answers are more interesting and in some cases more surprising than you'd thought. So the sort of shape of the book begins to take form in your head.
You start the book in the first chapter and first time describing each of three men I want you to help us with right now: Stalin, Trotsky, and Lenin. Did the three of them work together during the revolutionary time back in the 1917 area?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really talk about their lives, and their fates are all very much entwined. To sort of talk about the way that they interact is to sort of delve quite deeply into some of the sort of more obscure areas of sort of early 20th century revolutionary politics. But essentially they were would all go on to become members of what we now know as the Bolsheviks, who were socialist revolutionaries who were completely committed to overturning the established order, which in Russia meant the Romanovs, who had been czars of Russia for 5 centuries. Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, but for a long time, up until 1917, Trotsky had actually been part of a smaller antagonistic group within the socialist revolutionaries called the Mensheviks. And what pushed the two groups apart is one of those slightly obscure technical points that isn't particularly interesting anymore. But what it meant was that for a long time, Trotsky was seen as an outsider, and he was seen as an outsider in those circles right up until 1917, when suddenly the Tsar resigns, and this great opportunity opens up. People like Lenin and Stalin and Trotsky, whatever else they were people that had given their lives over completely to the idea of revolution. It was something that obsessed them in a way that I think perhaps, as members of the liberal democracies in the 21st century, I don't think we can quite understand the depth of the passion and fervor that animated them.
Make it a little bit easy on you. I have in front of me the dates when they lived and died and how old they were. Lenin was 53 years old when he died in 1924. Trotsky, and you, of course, deal with this in the book, was 60 years old when he died in 1940. And Stalin was 74 when he died in 1953. Would you describe as best you can, and it's in your book, these three men and what they were like?
Well, so Lenin is this very severe, forbidding, a former lawyer who was also an incredibly gifted revolutionary organizer. He was the person that his central thesis was that what you needed to effect a revolution was a small cadre of elite revolutionaries who could seize power and then take control of the whole country that they were creating the revolution in. He was, like all of the Bolsheviks, he was ruthless in his desire to seize and then hold on to power. He created, along with all the other Bolsheviks, but he was at its heart the apparatus of control over that country. He was the person who understood that terror was an essential part of government, at least as they understood it. Stalin was was from Georgia, which at the time was part of the Russian Empire. This is one of the ways in which Stalin and Trotsky's lives are in some ways very similar. Both of them are from the sort of edges of empire. So in Trotsky's case, he was from Ukraine. Both of them were from illiterate families. Both of them were bright, gifted students. Stalin was initially seemed set for a career as in the Russian Orthodox Church. Trotsky was a sort of star pupil at his schools. I mean, he was always incredibly clever, probably far too clever for his own good. But what dragged them all from the various corners of the empire was this passionate desire to create a socialist revolution. Stalin was perhaps more outwardly was more straightforward than Trotsky. He was a sort of slow-moving, short, slightly awkward figure who rarely spoke. He was essential to early on before the revolution. He sort of helped support a lot of what the Bolsheviks were doing by effectively acting as a gangster. Whereas Trotsky was a lot more refined, a lot more cosmopolitan. Whereas Stalin spent a lot of the exile that was a sort of rite of passage for most Russian revolutionaries during this era in Siberia. Trotsky was in Austria, he was in Vienna, he was in London, he was in Paris, he was in Madrid. He was much more a creature of the sort of a more sophisticated creature of that sort of I don't know what we know of the Edwardian era. He was a great reader, a great thinker. He engaged with other ideas outside Marxism. So there was a sense of him as a much more flamboyant, stylish figure. He's this great speaker and orator who could move, crowds of thousands, wrote inflammatory pamphlets, whereas Stalin is much more recessive. But I think the mistake a lot of people made was just to assume that just because Stalin was silent and uncharismatic, that didn't mean